Microsoft has just released a threat matrix for DevOps. The purpose of developing this threat matrix by Microsoft is to build a comprehensive knowledge base that defenders can use to keep track of and build defenses against relevant attack techniques. They have used MITRE attack framework as a base, and then they also collected techniques and attack vectors associated with DevOps environments and then created this matrix. Now let's go through the tactics and the parts of this matrix one by one. The first one is about initial access. This initial access tactic refers to techniques as an attacker may use for gaining access to the DevOps resources, repositories, pipelines, and dependencies. And then there are various techniques which may be a precondition for the next step. For example, we have this SCM authentication access, which could be accessed by having an authentication method to organization source code management, and it could be a personal access token or SSH key, and similar things related to it. Then we have something called a CI/CD server service authentication. So an attacker can leverage authentication to the CI/CD service in order to attack the organization DevOps. Then organization might be using public repositories, or attacker could compromise the endpoint use, and it could be an existing compromise. So for example, attacker could gain access to a developer's workstation, and then from there it could gain access to organization SCM registry or any other the developer has access to. And then webhooks should also be secured, because when an organization has a webhook configured, an attacker could use it as an initial access method into organization network by using the SCM. So that is one thing which should also be taken into the consideration when configuring your webhooks for your CI/CD pipeline. The next one is execution tactic. The execution tactic refers to the technique that may be used by a malicious adversary to gain execution access on pipeline resources. And as is the case with the pipelines, we have different issues there. For example, we have something called as poison pipeline execution. So this basically refers to a technique where an attacker can inject code to an organization repository, resulting in code execution in repositories, CI/CD systems. And there are a lot of poison pipeline types like direct PPE, indirect PPE, public PPE, and for example, in cases where we have public PPE. So these are the cases where the pipeline is triggered by an open source project. In these cases, the attacker can use the direct PPE or indirect PPE on this public repository to infect the pipeline. And then we have something called as dependency tampering, which refers to a technique where an attacker can execute code in the DevOps environment by injecting malicious code into the repository's dependencies. So this is what dependency tampering is about, and there are different types of it. For example, typo squatting refers to some publishing malicious packages with similar names to known public packages. And then repo jacking is another thing, where hijacking, which means that hijacking a public package by taking control of the maintainer account. Then another tactic is DevOps resources compromise. So consider this: pipelines are at the core a set of compute resources executing the CI/CD agents alongside other software. An attacker can target these resources by exploiting a vulnerability in the operating system, or in the agent code, or in the other software installed in the VM. So these could be compromised. Then an attacker can gain control of a registry used by the organization, doing the same thing. Next broader category is the persistence category. The persistent tactic consists of different techniques that an attacker may use for maintaining access to victim's environment. And this could be various things. It could be like changes in the repository, or it could be um, injecting different malicious artifacts into the legitimate artifacts, and then the registry images could be modified, or even attacker could initiate some brute force attack on service credentials. Another tactic is privilege escalation. This is actually quite common and more common than you would think. The privilege escalation techniques are used by an attacker to elevate the privileges in the victim's environment. So, by that way, they can gain higher privileges for already compromised resources. And they could range from different things like secrets in private repositories, or committing or pushing to protected branches, or even certificates and identities from the metadata service. And this certificates and identities are more common in the cloud hosted pipelines, where attacker could get access to metadata services from inside the pipeline and extract certificates and identities from these services. Then we have credential access. So this could be user credential or the service credential. So in terms of user credentials, these are the cases where the customer requires access to external services from the CI pipelines. It could be any CI secrets, environment variables, or even the database. Whereas a service credential is where you need to get some SaaS tokens or even service principal names, which could allow access to other services from the pipeline. Then we have lateral movement tactic. The lateral movement tactic refers to the technique used by attackers to move through different resources. So, in the CI/CD environment, this may refer to moving to deployment resources to build artifacts and registries to new targets. Again, there are a lot of ways this could be done. For example, um, the artifacts could be compromised, or registry could be infected with malicious code, or even um, attacker could infect the registry with the infected or malicious container images, and from there it could spread to other deployment resources. Another tactic is defense evasion. This technique could be used by attacker to bypass defenses in the used DevOps pipelines, and this could be service log manipulation or compilation manipulation, or even reconfiguring the branch protection. Branch protection tools allows an organization to configure steps before a pull request is approved into branch. Once an attacker has admin permission, they may change these configurations and introduce code into branch without any user intervention. Another tactic is impact. Now, in this one, there are few familiar things like DDoS attack. So it could, so any attacker or adversary could use a compute resources they gained access to in order to execute DDoS, DDoS attack on external target. Cryptocurrency mining, another thing, local DOS, or even resource deletion. Then we have exfiltration tactic, which is quite common these days. This tactic refers to different techniques that could be used by an attacker to exfiltrate sensitive data from the victim environment. For example, um, once attacker have access to CI pipelines, they also gain access to the private repos, and therefore could clone and access the code. This is called as cloning private repositories. Pipeline logs are another thing which needs to be protected, because an adversary could access the pipeline execution logs, view the access history, the build steps, etc. And also, the exfiltration could happen from the production resources. In cases where the pipelines can access the production resources, the attacker will have access to these resources as well. So they also need to be protected. So, in a nutshell, the aim of this threat matrix by Microsoft is to help the defenders gain better understanding of the attack service surface associated with DevOps environment. Better understanding of these threats will help any defender to build stronger defenses and implement better coverage against these threats. So you can use this matrix to harden your repositories or even harden your pipelines and triggers. You can verify your dependencies and also make sure to review access to secrets from pipeline, and then limit the access accordingly. And all in all, you need to build a better organization culture which will implement the DevSecOps principle on the basis of these threat matrix tactics. I hope this was useful. If you have any comments or feedback, please put them in the comments. Thank you very much.